says The Torah, a Women's Commentary. Why do we use this book? Someone asked. It was a Shabbat morning, not so many weeks ago, in this very room, in our Shabbat morning minyan service that happens each week. I just passed out the book, aka The Torah, a Women's Commentary. I teach with it periodically throughout the year. Every Shabbat morning, as many of you know, we teach and we study in this service. But I use this book periodically, as the Torah portion calls me to do. I paused before I answered. I really thought I had explained the book enough, a lot. But then I realized I hadn't done it in a long time. Another story. Actually, can I hand my prop to Charlie? Thank you. Give a rabbi a Torah. Thank you. A few weeks ago, I was teaching our 7th grade girls. I do that once a month on Tuesday afternoons for Rosh Chodesh, for the beginning of the Hebrew month. Rabbi Daniels teaches the boys, I teach the girls. And so as part of our Rosh Chodesh session, I taught the girls about the prophet Miriam, and they made Miriam's cups. But before we did that, I asked them who's ever had a Miriam's cup on their Seder table, and none of the girls had. They had never seen one. But I really haven't been teaching this stuff enough. And then last week, or a couple weeks ago, the great-grandmother of our bat mitzvah in the large sanctuary came up after the service beaming. She marveled at what girls can do these days. She, up in her 90s, said, I couldn't do that when I was a child. I assured her she could do it here. We've had some adult bat mitzvah, benot mitzvah who are in their 80s and 90s. In essence, to paraphrase that old, was it Virginia Slim's ad, we've come a long way, but we've not come far enough. For most of Jewish history, the key focal points of Jewish spirituality were prayer and study. And these were the domain of men. Jewish women, according to halakha, or Jewish law, are traditionally exempt from what are called positive, time-bound mitzvot. That is, positive commandments, the things that they do as opposed to don't, and that have a set time for their observance. For example, praying 3 times a day. There are 3 exceptions to that rule. The most familiar is that of lighting Shabbat candles. That is one that is traditionally a mitzvah, an obligation for a woman, but no worries, men, you're allowed to do it. We encourage you to do it with us. The thinking throughout our history was not meant to be sexist. It was really to give the women roles of keeper of family and home. Over time, and I'm taking great liberties with passages of time through history, women developed their own paths of spiritual meaning, studying and praying, even creating their own prayers called techinot. That is, prayers that encompass the things that were important to them. For example, let my challah rise. Let my husband come back from his journey on a ship. My children should be healthy. My pregnancy should be good. Women's work and spirituality was the home, so that's what their prayers were about. Their job was to keep dietary laws, prepare for the holidays, and care for family. These paths were powerful and personal, but they weren't generally recorded. Probably because before the 17th century, women received very little Jewish education, probably very little education, formal education generally. And so the words of our tradition were written by men who had more education. So male voices were recorded throughout history. We now know, with scholars going back in time to archaeology, to history, from mining Jewish texts for references to women and implications, that there in fact have been Jewish women leaders throughout time. There actually been archaeological evidence of women leaders in communities in ancient Israel. One really fascinating example, maybe just to me, I don't know, but was that of a woman called a Zogurki. In the 13th century, there was the rare female prayer leader who actually did know the prayers and could lead them for women who couldn't read them, for whom they weren't accessible. And as my incredible teacher, Professor Ellen Umansky, explains, There's no evidence no evidence to suggest that before the 17th century, when European Jewry entered what we call modernity, there's no evidence to think that Jewish women thought of their world, that is of the home, as subordinate or peripheral to Jewish life, contrary to what we might think today. After all, Jewish life was centered on the home and the children. That was the key continuity for Jewish life. Historical jump again. With the emancipation of European Jewry came change. Women gained learning, a connection in the greater society, and they began to question their roles in Jewish life. We have writings from the 19th century that question what women's roles and men's roles were about. And then we get into the 1830s, we see women's efforts to create social, philanthropic, and educational organizations. Some of you, certainly some of our women here who traveled to Philadelphia last year, heard about Rebecca Gratz. She created the United States' first Hebrew Sunday schools. Anyone know where? Philadelphia. That was a good hint I gave you, right? To educate boys and girls. So those of you who weren't sure how you felt about religious school, Sunday school, you can thank Rebecca Gratz. Come a long way there. As we go through time, women published, women learned, and thanks to our own Reform Judaism, the declaration that women were spiritually equal to men, yes, back in the 19th century, Reform Judaism said this, women and men found really equal rights and religious rights and responsibilities in the home and in the synagogue. So between this understanding, prayer entering the vernacular, right, prayer no longer being solely in Hebrew, and the opportunity for leadership roles in the synagogue, Reform Judaism gave women new opportunities to create and fulfill spiritual expressions. Now we jump to the late 19th century. We see in Judaism and in the greater society, but here in Judaism, we see Jewish women expressing their spiritual voices in a moral context, at home and in the world. They wrote, they spoke, they acted. You probably know some of these examples. Who's heard of Chicago Women's Aid? Yes, like Carol Farber's not. Yeah. Chicago Women's Aid introduced penny lunches in the schools. They hired a dietitian and provided the associated Jewish charities, precursor, I believe, to our own Jewish United Fund, with a visiting nurse. Settlement houses. Heard of those? Settlement houses were established and run by women. Lillian Wald is perhaps American Jewry's best-known female social worker. What did she champion? Child welfare, public health, nursing, and women's suffrage. By 1913, nearly every Reformed temple in the country had a sisterhood, and they were united under an umbrella called the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods. Anyone know what happened in 1893 as part of the Parliament of World Religions at the Chicago World's Fair? Henrietta Greenbaum Solomon created the National Council for Jewish Women. Around a little bit later, Henrietta Sold created Hadassah. As we entered the 20th century, we saw and heard women's voices more, writing, speaking, and education, and the labor movement, and the synagogue, and efforts for women's suffrage. And think about your own family histories now. We know that women's roles were changing. How many of us had grandmothers and great-grandmothers, maybe even mothers, who were in the workforce, as we certainly in the early years as they were immigrants in sweatshops, but then later with World War II and women entering the workforce and women entering education, getting higher education. Jump again in time. Again, these are broad swaths of history. There's much more to be told in great history. Then we get to the 60s, the women's movement, the growth in ethnic awareness in so many places. And what do we find? We find women's Jewish ritual increasing. Bat mitzvah, which started in 1922, thanks to the vision of Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan, gained a foothold. We had Rosh Chodesh, or women's groups creating, other rituals created. The first women's Seder was held, I think a few decades later. But in 1972, anyone know what happened? Rabbi Sally Priesand was ordained as the first woman rabbi in the United States. We used to think the first woman rabbi, but the first woman rabbi was ordained on the eve of World War II, Rabbi Regina Jonas, and she died in the Holocaust. So while this is a broad swath of history, it paints a really interesting and good picture for us. As Professor Umansky explains, Jewish spirituality is not, and indeed has never been, monolithic. Jewish women were traditionally encouraged to develop a particular kind of spirituality that is spontaneous, emotional, and private. But with women's greater access to Jewish learning, their assumption of more public religious roles, and the creation of new blessings, rituals, midrash, teaching, and feminist theology, many Jewish women in recent decades have been able to explore what were less traditionally female ways of discovering the divine, not just study and prayer, the traditional realms of the past, but including those. And in so doing, Umansky writes, the religious paths that they have taken have been and continue to be remarkably diverse. In other words, there are many paths for all of us, women and men, to express our spirituality. In 1990, Professor Judith Plaskow published a groundbreaking work called Standing Again at Sinai. Think about it. Sinai, when our ancestors got the commandments, got the Torah, she said, let's go back to Sinai. Her title acknowledges that our Jewish texts were written by men, and women's voices were absent. She said they're sacred. We're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but we need to go back and we need to bring women's voices and interpretation to Torah. Since Judith Plaskow published this theology, we've seen amazing change in the Jewish community. We've even seen women come very close to ordination within Orthodox Judaism. Not quite rabbis, but really close. We here at North Shore Congregation Israel should feel so proud of the diverse expressions of women's spirituality. We have, I think it's 27, maybe 28 years of women rabbis in our congregation. We have 20 years of women seders. I don't know how many Miriam's cups and oranges have been put on people's family seder plates because women have been at our seders. We have a rich history and present of our women as leaders in our congregation, as presidents in our congregation, and currently I'm looking at Marilyn Perlman, our president, as leaders in sisterhood, women of North Shore Congregation Israel, as our name has changed, as board members, as leaders in education and social justice, so much of women rolling up their sleeves to make a difference in our community and our world. And how about the 120 people who've been called to the Torah as adult B'nai Mitzvah in the last 20 years? Most of them have been women. By the way, they have spanned ages from 28 to 95. There are ongoing conversations about God, prayer, language, music. And then there's all the work that WNSCI, the Women of North Shore Congregation Israel, does. I can't even give you the entire list this evening, but let me point out the underwriting of programming and scholarships. You know that our religious school gives out tremendous assistance to anyone who needs help in tuition through the Mayor Schisler Fund. And WNSCI is a generous supporter among the many things you all do. Think about our community's openness to new ritual, Vashti's banquet, alternative Yisker, rituals for new moments, good and bad in our lives. The women who gather each year to study, to lead us on trips, to lead us on our women's retreats, who read books, who discuss, who learn, who challenge us. We should feel proud, but not complacent. Indeed, we've come a long way, but we haven't come far enough. But we're not stopping either, I promise. As for that book, okay, Charlie, I'll take it back, thank you. So back to the book. This book was published 11 years ago. It was published by the press of the Reform Movement, the URJ Press, and it was published because of a challenge given by Cantor Goldstein's dear friend and colleague, Cantor Sarah Sager, who challenged the women of Reform Judaism to do this. This was funded by the Women of Reform Judaism and edited by two incredible professors, Professor Tamara Cohn Ashkenazi, and Rabbi Dr. Andrea Weiss, who, as a point of history, is the provost of the Hebrew Union College, and last Sunday was the first woman to ordain rabbis. So what is this book? Why do we use it? It's the Torah, the same words of Torah that are in the scrolls in our ark. But the difference is the commentary. Selections from ancient teachings, contemporary poetry, current scholarship, all of it culled and edited and selected by women. Men's voices are here, the traditional commentary and midrash, but it's through the lens of women's experience, particularly to that which was not present in earlier Torah commentaries. But it's a text for women and men. Why do we use it? We use it precisely because of the critique given by Judith Plasko, because women's voices are absent in our history. This Chumash, this Torah commentary, is a gift of voices, of women's voices for all of us, whatever our gender. It brings new insights about history, about women, about our lives today, about our study of Torah. This book and so much of our experience affirms and articulates women's spirituality and men's spirituality, all of our spirituality. And it should move us on our Jewish journeys, individually, collectively, our Jewish journeys. It's a journey that continues. Because if we're still asking the questions and we're still wondering about Miriam's cup, then we're still wondering how many men we need for a minyan. You don't just need men for a minyan. When Rabbi Geffen and I walk into the house and they say, "You need 10 men?" and we smile. It happens. And so many other questions. If we're still asking these questions, well, then we have a long journey to go. But let's step back this Shabbat and recognize with pride the accomplishments of our Reform movement, of Judaism generally, and certainly within North Shore Congregation Israel. And let's keep journeying and studying together.